just say a few things about Iron Sharpens Iron. We're here very much to help each other to be better disciples of Jesus. And so we have a program where we have people being interviewed, and it's really a part of the Ministry of Thinking Faith Network. And we believe it's important that we learn from each other, we gain insight from each other, and we challenge each other. So that's why we're doing that. I just want to introduce to you Jonathan Chaplin, who has been interviewed before. Jonathan is an associate fellow at Theos, a member of the Cambridge Divinity Faculty, which is good to hear, and a former director of the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics. I want to mention two of his books, if you will give me that permission. He is the author of Faith in Democracy, Framing a Politics of Deep Diversity. I've read that book and it's very, very good. And his new one that I confess I haven't yet read. So Jonathan, I apologize to you for that. It is a very, very good book. And he's also the author of Beyond Establishment, Resetting Church-State Relations in England. And I must say, today I read an interview by the former Bishop of London, Richard Chartres, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, about your book, Jonathan. So I was delighted to read that. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan now. And Jonathan, you can interview our dear friend David from Hamilton in Ontario. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. And let me just say what a fantastic pleasure it is to be having this conversation with David. I think I first met David probably about 40 years ago when we were just passing ships in the night at ICS as students, and kept in touch as times and circumstances permitted over the years as a colleague and as a friend. So it's just a great pleasure to be talking to you, David. Learned so much from your work, admired so many of your publications, and so I'm dying to get stuck into this conversation. So David is presently a global scholar with an organization called Global Scholars Canada. For 30 years, he was a professor of political science at Redeemer University College, Christian University in Southern Ontario. The book that we're going to be focusing on tonight, I'm just going to wave in front of you, Political Visions and Illusions, a survey and Christian critique of contemporary ideologies, is a book, well, I won't quite say it never leaves my bedside, but it never leaves my desk. It's a book I've drawn on since its first edition in 2003. I've used it in teaching in many settings. I've quoted it all over the place. And whenever I need to refresh my my thinking on contemporary political ideologies and other things, that's the book I first turned to. So it's a wonderful book. And let me say that the book's been highly praised by a number of very prominent thinkers, Reformed thinkers, and thinkers from other theological traditions, including Tim Keller, Richard Mao, Jim Skillen, and many others too. It is actually the recipient of the 2004 Word Guild Award. And in 2003, so that's the first edition we're talking about, it was selected by the editors for the editor's bookshelf of Christianity Today. It's been translated into, I believe, David, Portuguese and Spanish. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Yeah. Spanish edition just came out 2 months ago.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And so, yeah, David maintains a community of scholars and students and others in the Iberian world, you could say, here and in Latin America. Let me just also add that David has just completed a wonderful 6-part blog series that we won't talk too much about today, commenting on and interpreting the implications of the recent Supreme Court decision in the USA to overturn Roe v. Wade, which granted constitutional rights to abortion to American women. It's a 6-part series. It's on his blog site, which is going to appear on in the chat function any moment now. And I'd certainly recommend you reading that series if you're interested in that issue. It's a model of careful, critical, reflective, and insightful analysis on that really, really difficult contested question. So we are going to have a conversation for approximately 55 minutes. I'm going to go up to about 9 o'clock, give or take. And then there'll be a full half hour for Q&A, which I'll try to moderate. So I'm going to present David with a series of questions, and he's going to take several minutes to reflect on those questions. There might be a bit of back and forth in response to what he says between us, but essentially the floor will be David's as I pose these questions to him. So
could I say one thing beforehand?
Oh, yes,
is that I think your book, Faith and Democracy, is absolutely an excellent book. And I think it's the sort of book that needs to be written or maybe revised every 10 years to take into account developments that have occurred. And I wish we had one of those for North America as well. So it's just a brilliant book, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say, David. Yeah, I'll mark that in my 10-year diary.
Revision needed, yes.
So let's jump straight in, because there's so much to discuss and there'll never be enough time to discuss everything. So at the heart of the book, David, Political Visions and Illusions, are two powerful and really quite controversial claims. The first is that modern political ideologies like liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and so forth are at bottom political manifestations of idolatry, that very strong biblical word. And the second claim is that every ideology, just like the Bible, has a narrative structure within which there is what David calls a redemption story. In other words, you're saying that these ideologies are not simply abstract political principles that freewheel through contemporary debate. They are powerfully religiously informed and are the symptom of a fundamentally distorted political faith. And what I love about the book especially is that you show that such a reading in the light of those two core claims allows you to do two things. First, to show the deficiencies and pathologies of ideologies, in some cases really perniciously evil pathologies, but also it allows you to show where these ideologies strike upon really important, valid insights into society and into creation as made by God, from which we can learn. So my opening question is a broad one. Can you please tease out these core claims for us?
Yes, certainly I can do that. Idolatry, as you've indicated, is a biblical category, and it's one that we find at the very beginning. One could say that in Genesis chapter 3, the sin of our first parents in the garden was basically one of idolatry. The temptation to see themselves as gods, and of course, pride and idolatry go hand in hand. I'm not really sure that there's a meaningful distinction between them, because I think pride in many respects has to do with esteeming ourselves way too highly, thinking of ourselves as little gods, if you will. Idolatry is not something that we point to others out there and accuse them of, and that's one of the things that I would want to discourage people from using my book as a kind of culture war type of a track that we could point to others and say, you're idolaters. Rather, I think we need to look into our own hearts and to see the idols that we have created for ourselves. And that's what I try to do in this book. So people who are reading it, I hope they would not take it in such a way as to say, my opponents, they're idolaters, but I hope that they would look into their own proclivities, into their own maybe their own policy preferences and the groups that follow these preferences, and to say, well, where have we gone awry? Where have we missed out? And of course, the idols that we read about in the Old Testament, they are concrete physical idols made of such natural objects as wood and stone. But as we look at those, we recognize that there's nothing wrong with wood and stone intrinsically. because wood and stone are the good creation of God. So an idol, when we worship an idol, we take something out of God's good creation, something that in itself is good, and we make too much of it. We make a god of it. And I think that's what the various ideologies do as well. So with respect to liberalism, individual freedom is something that is very good indeed. And I think we can be thankful that liberals have been so jealous, have been so concerned to protect individual freedom. But we cannot have a society in which individual freedom takes precedence over every other valid consideration. We lose out on community. We lose out on the responsibilities that we have to each other and to the various groups and communities of which we are a part and in which we are embedded. And so individual freedom can become an idol. For socialists, economic solidarity can become an idol as well that can squeeze out other legitimate considerations. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with either individual freedom or with economic solidarity. And I think that's what we need to be aware of. With respect to the second focus on the redemptive narratives that are underpinning the ideologies, this was a change from the first edition of Political Visions and Illusions. Because in the first edition, I treated each of these ideologies as manifestations of idolatry. But the redemptive stories underpinning them were only implicit in the first edition. So when I was revising the book for a second edition in 2017, 2018, that's something that I decided to bring to the foreground, because I thought it was important for us to see, if we are talking about an idol, if we're talking about the religious underpinnings of political ideologies, that we needed to see the story that they tell. And of course, the stories that are told will condition the discussions or the conversations that we have based on those stories, based on those ideologies. And so that's what I do in the second edition, and that's a significant change from the first edition.
Okay, thanks very much. Maybe just one quick follow-up to that. So in the book you argue, you briefly mentioned it, I think just then, that idolatry is the worship of something which is itself a creature.
Yes.
In other words, it's something which is inherently good, but which is distorted by virtue of its being worshipped.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but people could understand that, I think, in relation to nature, right, or the physical or the material realm. But it's harder, I think, for a lot of people to make sense of that in terms of social realities, social institutions, or institutions like the state, for example. I mean, in what sense? So if an ideology somehow worships the state, let's say, or worships some aspect of society, such as, the individual or the nation, anticipating, in what sense is that worshipping something in creation?
Well, creation, yes, creation is not just nature. And I think that's where a lot of people go awry. We have a tendency to think, well, we are enjoying God's creation if we are up in the Lake District, this is about to my British friends, or if we are in Algonquin Park, which my wife and daughter and I visited up in Northern Ontario last month. That we are out in God's creation. But God's creation, everything that is not God, is God's creation. And so that it includes human beings. It includes all of the social formations that we come up with throughout all of human history. All of that is part of creation. So if we are thinking of individual freedom, if we think of economic solidarity, if we think of national solidarity or a democratic participation, those are all elements. They may seem abstract to us on first blush, but as a matter of fact, they are key elements of God's creation that we experience on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Let me move on to the second key question. You've already anticipated this a little bit in your references to liberalism, but I mean, it's clear that the ideology that has most shaped Western societies, and so in turn, societies that have been dominated by the West, which today is probably most of them, is some version of liberalism. And of course, liberalism does come in different versions. Indeed, in your chapter on liberalism, I was particularly struck by your analysis of what you call the 5 stages of liberalism, mainly Western liberalism, I think you have in mind. And in particular, the argument that I think will resonate with a lot of people here, that in recent decades, we have moved from what you call an equal opportunity state to a choice enhancement state. Can you explain how liberalism exemplifies the core claims you've just been talking about idolatry and so forth, and where that analysis of the 5 stages of liberalism fits in terms of that? And then also noting, by the way, that this is a moment when a lot of people are predicting the death, or even announcing the death of liberalism. Where do you think liberalism is heading? Is it dying? Or are we entering a 6th stage, or are we stuck in the 5th stage?
Right.
So it's really 2 parts to that question. How is liberalism an example of idolatry, and what's its trajectory today?
Yes. Yeah. I think I covered the first part of that question before, but I think that liberalism revolves heavily around individual liberty, or we may say even human rights. And I think that's probably something that we hear more of today in various intellectual popular circles. Human rights, even more than we do individual liberty. Individual liberty may sound a little bit quaint to us, I suppose. We may think of people like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, 17th and 19th century figures. I think the notion of human rights is something that probably resonates with a lot of people. Canada's own Michael Ignatieff has written a number of books about human rights, and he has taught in the field of human rights. But I think that to try to build a society around individual liberty, or the rights of individuals, or whatever we choose to call them, I think that's something that's inherently unstable. And I think that's a key to unlocking the idolatrous character of liberalism. The various ideologies that are dominant in our world today, there's always some kind of a tension within them that cannot be resolved. And that leads to a certain instability in the ideology. In the case of liberalism, it has led, I have argued, through these 5 stages. So beginning with the Hobbesian Commonwealth, and of course the reference there is to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, very long-lived philosopher from 1588 to 1679, a very old age even for our day. For the 16th and 17th century was an extraordinary old age. And he believed that societies were composed of individuals. He was not a liberal, he was not a Democrat in the sense in which we would think of that right now, but he laid the philosophical and the spiritual groundwork for liberalism as it would develop over the course of centuries. Now, he believed that an all-powerful sovereign was necessary in order to keep the peace. Then the Hobbesian Commonwealth mutates into the night watchman state. And here we have John Locke. He's the paradigmatic figure in this particular stage of the history of liberalism. John Locke used all of the same categories that Hobbes did. For example, the state of nature, the social contract, and so forth. Even something like his appeal to heaven is something that we find at least implicitly in Thomas Hobbes as well. And the night watchman state is supposed to be a very small scale state that limits itself to keeping the peace, both internally and externally. But it turns out that that's not sufficient, because out of that individual freedom, people can exploit each other. And of course, in the economic realm, this became obvious by the time of the Industrial Revolution in England in the 18th century, and in the United States and Germany and other countries in the 19th century. And it turned out that, that people were using the freedom to oppress others, especially those that came to be called the industrial working class. So this led to something called the regulatory state, which is the third stage in the development of liberalism. And I think the paradigmatic figure for this stage is Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century. And he wanted to try to expand the state to check this industrial baronage that, that was dominating the economies of so many Western countries. The United States in the late 19th century, you had a very few wealthy private entrepreneurs such as J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, who could build and sink an economy overnight. There's one story that after I think the panic of, was it 1883 or the Depression of 1883? I may have the year wrong, but one of these industrial barons waiting outside the White House for the president to call him in, because the president knew that there wasn't much he could do to prevent this industrial baron from sinking the economy or saving it, because there was nothing comparable to the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve Board or the Bank of Canada. The economies were pretty much at the hands of a very few private entrepreneurs. And so in that kind of a context, you have Theodore Roosevelt coming along and saying, we need to change that. People are suffering under this laissez-faire form of a market economy. And so that led to the antitrust acts in the United States, for which there's nothing really comparable in Great Britain or Canada. By the 1930s, we have the Depression, the Great Depression occurring, the stock market crash in New York in late 1929. And then Teddy Roosevelt's distant cousin Franklin Roosevelt comes to the White House, and that brings about the fourth stage, which I've called the equal opportunity state. And so during that stage, there's an effort on the part of the government to try to create the conditions, to try to not just to regulate the economy, to try to check these industrial barons and these large trusts, but to enhance the stature of ordinary people on the ground, ordinary working class and people and farmers and so forth, so that they'd be able to find their way through the vicissitudes of the Great Depression. This equal opportunity state, I think, remained the dominant form of liberalism up until maybe about 60 years ago, when I was just a small child, and then that yielded to something that I call the choice enhancement state. So it is not simply enough to provide a social safety net through the welfare state, but now it's necessary for the state to enhance people's opportunities to choose in virtually every area of life, whether that's economics, whether that has to do with with sexuality or identity. That choice becomes the be all and the be all. I'm going to butcher this particular cliche, but it comes to be the most important thing in life. And so the state ends up having to expand considerably beyond what was ever envisioned by John Locke or Adam Smith in the 17th or 18th century. So each of these stages sees the state expanding and being given more powers to within the social fabric. So that's the fifth stage.
David, that's really helpful, and that cues me to perhaps bring in here the recent Supreme Court decision reversing Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade could be seen as, in a sense, one of the first major constitutional statements of the choice enhancement state. But now, of course, it's been overturned,
yes,
which indicates a significant reversal for that kind of liberalism. So, you know, what is the future of this stage? Is it running into the barriers? You know, is it being overtaken by something else, or is this just a temporary blip?
Well, I think the choice enhancement state, you know, liberalism is it valorizes the individual. It makes the individual a god. But of course, no society can really function if there are not constraints, not just legal, political constraints, but social constraints, cultural constraints on people's on the choices that people make on a day-to-day basis. And so I think what we are seeing now is that liberalism is not exactly running aground, but the valorization of the individual creates something akin to Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, in which there's a kind of war of all against all. It's not to say that within Western societies, we are literally in a kind of continual warfare against everybody, but it is true that I think that this choice enhancement state has raised people's expectations so far as to what they can do, as to the choices that they can make, that people are now running into each other's legitimate personal spheres. And so this choice enhancement state has led to a kind of maybe a constrained level of warfare, but certainly overheated rhetoric. I've been watching the January 6th hearings on television along with my wife, and I'm seeing, you know, that this is something that I was born in the United States. I lived in Canada for 35 years, but I was born in the US, not far from Chicago. The country that I left behind, the country that I'm seeing now does not look like the country that I left behind 3.5 decades ago. And I find that very disturbing. Sometimes it's enough to bring tears to my eyes when I see what's happening. And just the level of animosity that I see in the United States, to a lesser extent here in Canada, but we still have some of that here. I think probably the United Kingdom, other countries as well. I find it very sad, but I think this choice enhancement state, the expectation that with the progress of human history, we will have ever more options in front of us from which to choose, and that somehow the good life exists not in living according to virtue, I suppose, as Aristotle would put it, or living in accordance with the will of God, as Christians would see it, but simply having all sorts of options and being able to choose, full stop. It's become an end in itself, and that can only lead to conflict. And I think this is what we're seeing.
That's fascinating, David. So liberalism ends up disappearing into itself when we get back to Hobbes. That may provoke a few questions later on, but moving on, because we've got a lot to get through still. Can we move on to nationalism? I've selected 3 ideologies, by the way, for our conversation: liberalism, nationalism, and democracy, for reasons that will become clear. So clearly nationalism today is the major challenger to liberalism, I'd suggest. Now, there are relatively peaceful and democratic versions of nationalism, as you well know, such as Quebec. You might not like it, but it's peaceful, it's democratic. Scotland, or even perhaps Catalonia, although they were willing to break the law to achieve their ends, but mostly peacefully. But there are also very troubling versions of nationalism virtually everywhere in the world, such as Hungary's so-called illiberal Christian democracy, as the Prime Minister calls it, Viktor
Orban. Yes. Yeah.
How does nationalism exemplify your central argument? And in particular, I think we'd be particularly keen to hear your reading of Putin's Russian nationalism.
Yes. Yeah, and perhaps I'll begin by saying a little bit about my own background, because I have paternal roots in the island of Cyprus. My father was born in 1928 as a British subject in what was then the Crown Colony of Cyprus. And Cyprus, of course, was divided in 1974 between Greeks and Turkish, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. And so and all of my relatives in the Greek Cypriot community, all of them became refugees overnight including my elderly grandparents who had to sleep in the fields for about 2 weeks before my father's eldest brother found them and was able to bring them to safety. So I have to admit that when I look at nationalism, I have a kind of emotional an emotional response, a negative emotional response to nationalism, because I saw what Greek ethnic nationalism did to Cyprus. My father's best friend was a Turkish Cypriot who was almost certainly a cousin of some sort. My DNA tests has determined that I have a lot of distant cousins with the names like Mustafa and Adnan and typical Turkish names. So I think Greek and Turkish Cypriots come from a single genetic gene pool, although you might not get them to admit it. So when I think of nationalism, I think of something that's very harmful indeed. I think about the Greek nationalist terrorists in Cyprus in the late 1950s, who were terrorizing even my aunt, who had been courted by a Turkish Cypriot. That's the sort of thing that I think of with respect to nationalism. There is nothing in itself wrong with national solidarity, and admittedly, I have to force myself to say that because I have trouble believing it in my heart of hearts. But in my cognitively, I have to admit that that national solidarity, that the solidarity that exists between people who have considerable commonalities tying them together, language, religion in many cases, the cultural mores, ways of relating to each other, that the solidarity that holds people together, that's something that's good. And I think God has created us to form communities. A national community may be one of those communities, a very informal type of community to be sure. It has somewhat ragged edges, but nationhood itself is a good. Nationalism, as soon as you add that ism at the end of it, it can be, although not necessarily an indication that something is amiss, that maybe we're esteeming nation far more than we ought to, that we are making a god out of our nation.
And do you want to sort of illustrate that in terms of President Putin's nationalism? Because I know that you've written about that. I mean, this seems to be a particularly dramatic and pernicious example of the worst.
Oh, absolutely. There's something called Ruski Mir. Ruski Mir. It's a Russian world. This ideology that if you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I have a great deal of admiration for the late Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian novelist, but I think he was in the grip of this Ruski Mir ideology that comes out in some of his writings. The idea that Russia has a kind of special place in the economy of God's dealings with human beings, and that somehow Russia is Holy Russia, Mother Russia, Holy Russia, and Putin is a believer in this, Vladimir Putin, and honestly, I can hardly pronounce the name of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow without wanting to spit at the same time. I myself was not raised Orthodox. My father was, but I am just close enough to Orthodox Christianity that when I see somebody like Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and the way that he has cozied up to Vladimir Putin and this Ruski Mir ideology, it just enrages me. It angers me to no end. He has no business being the head of a major branch of the Christian church, and it bothers me to no end. But this Ruski Mir, this Russian world ideology, I think it's damaging, and we're seeing it playing out in Ukraine now. But we've also seen it played out in Georgia. In 2008, we saw it played out in Crimea. In 2014, in Luhansk and Donetsk, the far eastern provinces of Ukraine, and also in Russia's dealings with its neighbors and sometimes with its own minorities as well.
And isn't this a classic example, if not perhaps yet the worst, of how nationalism, which is supposed to champion the culture of one nation, almost inevitably ends up becoming imperialism?
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. In the and it may be a subtle imperialism. I think for Russians, it's been always in the foreground, and it has been for a long time. You know, because the old principality, the Muscovite principality, back in the 15th, 16th century was fairly small. It just kept expanding until it covered virtually half the globe. You know, and I want to be careful. I was born in the United States, so I'm going to say something about the American sense of nationhood, recognizing that I still retain U.S. citizenship. So I'm not looking at the United States as an outsider by any means, but this idea of this manifest destiny for Americans, this idea of the American experiment or American exceptionalism, as it were. I'm highly allergic to such expressions. I have to admit. You know, it leads to not just on the part of right wingers, but even progressives. Somebody like President Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago, at the end of the Great War, you know, trying to come up with a new world order revolving around this League of Nations. You know, a good idea if the Americans had bought into it, and so forth. But the idea that somehow it's possible to take democratic institutions that work in one country and try to transplant them into other countries with very different cultural assumptions, very different mores, different language, different laws. And I don't mean just laws on the books, but the kinds of laws, customs that regulate the way that people relate to each other. You know, even that I think is very harmful, because it has led Americans into far-flung adventures across the globe, which are not obviously in the national interest of the United States as an ordinary, modest nation state.
Okay, thanks very much. Maybe we can move on now to the third ideology that I wanted to hear you on, and that's democracy. Now, interesting, in the book you make a crucial distinction between democracy as a system and democratism as an ideology. Can you spell out what that means? And you know, what is democratism, and how can we rescue it? How can we rescue democracy from democratism?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That was one change from the first to the second edition of this book, because I didn't use the word democratism in the first edition. I think I used democracy as creed or democracy as ideology, but I thought, you know, to make it parallel with the other ideologies, I thought democratism. I doubt that I invented the word as such, but I think it describes what I'm trying to get at. 1947. Winston Churchill, who was in opposition by that time, having been defeated by Clement Attlee 2 years earlier at the very end of the Second World War, he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried from time to time. Nobody could have accused Winston Churchill of having exaggerated expectations for democracy. And I think, you know, that's something that I would constantly quote to my students, because I think it was a very wise thing to say. And I think he recognized that democracy, you know, if it's just the rule of the people can get out of hand. And this is something that has been recognized from time immemorial in the whole Western tradition of political philosophy, going back to Plato and Aristotle and Polybius and various other, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, you know, Johannes Althusius, coming up to the really into the 19th and 20th centuries. The idea of a pure democracy was thought of as something that was quite terrifying to most educated people up until fairly recently. better to have a kind of mixed constitution that would have elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. So monarchy being the rule of one, aristocracy being not literally the rule of the few, but rule of the most virtuous, the rule of the excellent, if you will, and then the rule of the many, in a kind of balanced constitution. And so you had somebody like Montesquieu, a Frenchman who very much admired the English Constitution, claiming that that England embodied this mixed constitution. To some degree, I think the American founders had in mind this mixed constitution when they were putting together their system in back in 1787. And but democratism is more than that. So in 1928, Alfred Smith ran for the American presidency for the Democrats. He was the first Roman Catholic to run for the presidency. And he was defeated by Herbert Hoover. But 5 years later, he made the statement in a speech to somewhere in the United States, and he said that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. So democracy, from Smith's standpoint, becomes a panacea. It becomes a cure-all. If things are not working adequately, democratize them. Half a century ago, the American political parties tried to democratize their candidate selection process. This is something that at the time, I think I was in high school when they were doing this. I didn't understand it fully. By the time I was an undergraduate, by the time I was in graduate school studying political science, I thought, this is a very bad thing. This is going to run aground. This will lead to disaster eventually. In the short term, it brought to the presidency Jimmy Carter, who had very little support amongst other Democratic officials, and he proved pretty much unable to govern the country. Had to face even his own party in the Congress. He had difficulty cooperating with. And then 2016, we have Donald Trump, who was nominated through this excessively democratic process. Donald Trump is a man who could not have gotten security clearance if he had applied for a job with the Central Intelligence Agency. But somebody can come to the presidency simply through democratic mechanism without any kind of vetting on the part of officials who would be in a position to know a candidate better than ordinary people would. And so in some respects, I think what we're seeing in the United States now is a byproduct of democratism run amok over the last half a century. It took almost half a century to run into the ground, but I think this is what we're seeing right now. And unfortunately, we in Canada are following Americans down this footpath.
So you've segued yourself into the very next question, which Rudy Hayward has already asked in chat, which is, what's the relationship between democratism and populism? But let me also tie that to nationalism, because it seems to me that populism, it goes under different names, populist nationalism, national populism, and so forth.
Yeah, that's right.
Is a kind of pathological fusion of some of the worst aspects of democratism and nationalism. That's my kind of initial reading of that. I mean, you see various versions of it. Of course, on one extreme, you've got the kind of brutal authoritarianism of, well, Putin, but also Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil.
Yes. Yeah.
And on the other hand, you know, you've got what we've got here, which is the kind of insouciant public school version of populism, kind of performative theatrical version, which nevertheless also does quite a lot of damage along the way. So there's a whole spectrum here, of course. But
even if it's entertaining to outsiders.
Yeah, it stopped being funny for us a long time ago.
I'm sure.
It was never funny. Anyway, so what do you make of this in terms of your schema of ideologies, and what is really happening in populism?
Yeah. Populism is it's difficult to pin down. You know, populism is it started out at the end of the 19th century in the United States as associated with something called the People's Party, and it was supposed to it wanted to break the power of the banking and business interests in the East. and it championed the rights of people in the West and the Midwest and in the South to some degree. It became allied with the Democratic Party by the turn of the 20th century. This particular People's Party, the Populists, as they were called. Populism since then has developed in different ways. There are such things as left-wing populism. There is such a thing as right-wing populism, and we're probably more familiar with that than we are with a left-wing variety at the present time. But it tends to lead to Napoleonic politics. A particular leader rises and claims that the people are behind me, and by dint of the people being behind me, I can do what I think is necessary in order to resolve whatever crises that we are facing right now. So, you know, an impatience with ordinary constitutional procedures, legal procedures. We're going to cut through that. We're going to cut the Gordian knot, and we're going to solve things. And I have the people behind me, and I'm going to do that. And there are certain figures that that rise on the backs of this popular sentiment. Now, how do we know that people are behind them? Well, because they tell us. They tell us, you know, people are behind me. You know, I can shoot somebody in Times Square, and I will still have the people behind me. And so it becomes a kind of trust, an exaggerated trust that people put in a Napoleonic leader. And that's probably the most diseased element of populism. It's supposed to help the people in some way against elites, but it ends up empowering a Napoleonic figure who runs roughshod over the elites and the people alike.
And just to add, see what you think of this. I mean, in the process, that Napoleonic strategy ends up either bypassing or further weakening civil society. You know, the realm standing between the state and the individual, which in fact historically and today remains the principal site of popular voice. So the people are not simply a homogeneous mass, they never are, except very occasionally when they all vote the same way on one issue, which is exceptionally rare. For the most part, they're sprawling, diverse, argumentative, boisterous mass of people in the middle, organized through a whole variety of, you know, intermediate institutions through which they have some kind of effective voice. Is that right? Do you think?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. That's right. Yes, and I think I think in many respects our politics today in the West, because of the influence of liberalism, you know, that it elicits a kind of opposition on the part of people who are more collectivist in their understanding of society, but collectivist in the wrong sense. They believe that, you know, socialism is based on this notion of common ownership of property. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, because there are numerous agents which are the subjects of which can be said to own property. You know, any kind of corporate entity can be seen as a subject for owning property. But what populism and socialism alike do is to try to erase all of that the variegated communities, what I call the pluriformity of society, or the pluriformity of authorities, to try to erase all of that and make it between me as an individual and you as an individual. So me as the leader, if I'm this populist leader, between me and thee, to use the old second person singular form in English, you know, between me and thee, you know, I am going to protect you. Doesn't matter, all these other communities that you're part of, they don't matter. They're completely out of the picture. So yes, you're quite right.
Yeah, that was very much confirmed in what was or were the most populist parties in the UK, namely UKIP, and then what became the Brexit Party, both of which were essentially the personal creations of Nigel Farage, who is a kind of tin pot Napoleon, you could say.
Yeah, right.
And you know, the point I want to make there is that, you know, the structure of those parties was classically populist in that they were fictions created by Farage, just merely platforms for mobilization, but actually offered no empowerment for party members. Everything was decided by Nigel Farage and his clique. So on a smaller scale, that's exactly what populism attempts to do at the national level.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah, and
oh yeah.
No, I was going to say, and it can backfire. And I'm thinking again about the grassroots ways that we have adopted, also in Canada, to try to elect leaders of political parties, because that itself encourages Napoleonic politics. Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, I don't believe he's sufficiently accountable to other office holders in Canada. I think the prime minister has too much unchecked power. One way to reverse that would be to give the power of electing a leader back to the parliamentary caucus, because the parliamentary caucus, they are the agents that know the prime minister. They can keep him in check. The people, as this nebulous entity, have no power to do that whatsoever. And so, ironically, going to the people, try to make everything excessively democratized, as in party candidate selection processes, that encourages the type of irresponsible monistic leaders who simply on the basis of their belief that they have the people behind them will try again to cut through ordinary legal and constitutional procedures.
That's interesting, David. As we speak, letters are going out right now from the Conservative Party to their 160,000 members to elect our next Prime Minister.
Right.
Somebody may want to pick that up in Q&A, but let's move on. I want to move on to what on your list is a seventh question. We'll see if there's time for the sixth later. So shifting gears slightly before we round up our formal discussion, we're doing really well in terms of time. So thank you, David. What are the key additions to your 2019 edition of the book, second edition? Is an intriguing concluding ecclesiological postscript, of which Richard Mauss says that it manages to clarify more issues in a few pages than many of the theological volumes I have read on the subject. So very briefly, why did you add that postscript? What is it saying?
Yeah, well, I actually had a lot of input from various people, in the run-up to proposing a second edition, and I discovered over the course of the time when the first edition was in print, and it was kept in print throughout the whole time from 2003 up until 2019, that it was being used in theological seminaries. And of course, in theological seminaries are there to train clergy, ministers, priests, and so I thought that for the second edition, I wanted to give something to them. I wanted to give something to people who are involved in the institutional church, not just those of us who are citizens and part of the larger body of Christ, which is what most of the book is aimed at, but to ministers, people who are participating in synodical assemblies, for example, for Christian denominations. And so that's why I wrote this ecclesiological postscript to try to come up with advice for people who are in the position of working with the institutional church and would have to address politics in some fashion.
Okay, and so what's your message to them?
My message is be careful. I guess that's the first thing I would say, that there are a lot of ways in which ministers and denominations can step out of line. Ministers should not be telling people whom to vote from the pulpit, except under very, very rare circumstances. For the most part, I think that it's not to say that Christians themselves should not be organizing, but they should organize on a different basis outside of the church as an institution. So I think ministers have to be very careful if they touch on political topics, because they could end up alienating the congregation on issues over which there could be legitimate disagreement. So, for example, should there be, this is a North American example, should there be a $15 or $20 an hour minimum wage? That there should be a minimum wage might be simply a matter of justice. But what that level should be, that's a matter of prudential consideration on the part of our elected representatives in our parliamentary bodies to come up with such a law. But denominations, Christian denominations in Canada, the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church, Anglican Church of Canada, come up with all of these political pronouncements, which our political leaders are not going to listen to anyway. But they're on very very specific issues on which there might be disagreement. So, for example, some denominations have said, well, we favor a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine issue. Well, to which I and many others might say, okay, well, that's fine, but what about a one-state solution in which you would have Jews and Israeli Jews and Palestinians being equal citizens of a single state? Why would that not be a possibility? Now, I personally think that that's not likely to work, but it's simply to say that the debate over that is not something that an institutional church should commit itself to. So the church has to be very careful when it speaks politically.